That's great. Thank you, Jim. Welcome to the City Club of Eugene's June 17th, 2022 program, The War in Ukraine, Causes and Effects. This is the 34th program of our 2021-22 programming year, and my name is Karin Knutson, and I'm City Club's president. Welcome to today's audience here with us in downtown Eugene, and to our live stream and listening audiences. All recent City Club programs are archived on City Club's YouTube and Facebook pages, as well as via podcast. And of course, programs are broadcast on public radio station KLCC on Monday nights at 7 p.m. We're delighted to have you with us here today. As we host today's program, it is the last day of the 2021-22 school year in Eugene's 4J and Bethel school districts. For those listening on Monday night, welcome. It is now the first day of summer vacation. Congratulations to everyone on completing this school year, especially congratulations to Eugene students, graduates, caregivers, and families. And thank you to our teachers, staff, volunteers, and leadership in Bethel and 4J school districts. We are so grateful for all that you do for our children and for our community. I'm the proud mom of 2 Eugenians, and I want to share something that I saw a few weeks ago, the morning after families of school children in Uvalde, Texas had experienced the unthinkable, and just days after families in Buffalo, New York had experienced the same. Dropping off my daughter at school, I looked across. The students were migrating towards the door and moving at a speed that only middle schoolers can achieve. And I noticed that our vice principal was standing outside at the head of the entry walk. And he was standing there present, greeting every child, smiling, nodding at every face and connecting. And I don't know if he meant it in this way, but what I saw in his action was such a clear demonstration of care, and that caring for one another is normal and so important in our community, and that demonstrating that care is so important to our community. It was a simple decision for him to be present to those students that morning and in that way, and so clear that he wanted to do what he could to reach the community that he cared for and felt responsible to. Especially on that heavy morning, it mattered so much, and I know that our teachers and staff have been making these same kinds of offerings of comfort and care and stability all year long in classrooms and hallways that are not so easily seen from the front of the school. But that care is felt nonetheless by our children, from kindergartners to graduating seniors, and it creates the space for curiosity and learning. It's been a long year. It's been full of adaptation and transition, challenges, sometimes great sadness, but also laughter and learning and wonderful moments together. And so thank you to our educators, congratulations to every family, and we wish you all a fantastic summer. Support for the City Club is provided by our members and both business and in-kind sponsors. Our diamond sponsors are Kaiser Permanente, the University of Oregon, Peace Health, and Lane Community College. We also receive generous support from the City of Eugene and from Lane County. You also can help to support City Club's programs and our mission to build community vision through open inquiry by becoming a member of City Club at our website, cityclubofeugene.org. In today's program, looking at the causes and effects of the war in Ukraine, we are delighted to be joined by Julie Hessler, PhD and Associate Professor of History at the University of Oregon, Keith Edens, retired diplomat and adjunct professor at the University of Oregon, and Christoph Ross, PhD and visiting professor at the University of Oregon. More biographical information about today's speakers is available on our website, cityclubofeugene.org. And thank you to Program Committee Chair Joel Corin for coordinating today's program, and also to Jennifer James Long, who will join us to moderate the Q&A portion today. Thank you, Jennifer. Members and non-members alike are invited to submit questions in person or via text. And so on to today's program. The ongoing conflict caused by Russia's invasion of Ukraine is of central international concern. The consequences of that war have already been felt around the globe, and the bravery of the Ukrainian people is an inspiration for us all. What is the history of the relations between Russia and Ukraine leading up to this conflict? And what does Russia hope to achieve? Experts on the history and cultures of this region will address these questions and describe the roles that Europe, the United States, and NATO play in helping Ukraine today. The fate of the Ukrainian refugees in Europe and elsewhere will also be discussed. Today's speakers have extensive experience in dealing with Russian and Eastern European countries and migration patterns around the globe. And it is now my pleasure to welcome Professor Julie Hessler to the podium.
So I've got 10 minutes to talk about the Russian side of this conflict, and there are a lot of different ways that you could approach this. I thought I would focus really on Putin's worldview and the way that Ukraine fits into that worldview. And this is a worldview not just distinctive to him, but widely shared by Russian nationalists, a major part of the political spectrum in Russia. So I have 4 themes that I'm going to try to just touch on very briefly. The first theme is Soviet nostalgia. The second, the idea of a Russian world in which Russians and Ukrainians are part of one nation. The idea that Ukraine is a failed state. And finally, the idea that Ukraine has been a pawn of the West. So those are my 4 things that I'm going to try to touch on really briefly. So with regard to Soviet nostalgia, Putin has gone on the record many, many times saying things along the lines of the collapse of the USSR was one of the great geopolitical catastrophes of the 20th century. He's called it a humanitarian tragedy. And I think that this, to some extent, comes as a surprise to Americans, because Americans were generally used to thinking of the Soviet Union as a repressive dictatorship that stifled intellectual life and religious freedoms, that stymied economic development with its bureaucratization and over-centralization. And so I think for Americans, it's like, what's there to miss about the USSR? Putin has a qualified answer to that. He sees, and again, Russian nationalists much more generally share this, they see some major positives in the Soviet experience. One of those positives was the strong state. A strong state, from this perspective, was able to maintain order domestically across 11 time zones. It ensured that the country's interests would also be taken into account in the international arena. Ideologically, they also appreciated some things about the Soviet Union. In the United States, when we thought about the Cold War, and we tended to think of the United States as the free world, the center of the so-called free world. And so we emphasized freedom as a core value of the US that the Russians did not share. On the Soviet side, though, there were also values that they appreciated. They thought of themselves as anti-imperialist and anti-racist. So they thought of themselves as uniquely altruistic in the international arena, as against what they perceived as America's tendency to use the language of freedom as a cover-up for supporting American interests abroad. But Putin also sees one major negative in the Soviet legacy that I think is connected to that anti-imperial idea. And that is that the Soviet Union, in its efforts to be something other than an imperial power, made great efforts back in the time after the Russian Revolution of 1917 to set up a non-imperial state structure, one that created republics based on the many nationalities, at least the larger ones, that inhabited that large Soviet state. So their effort was to promote multi-ethnic harmony by strengthening non-Russian languages, cultures, and political identities at the expense of Russian ones. Now, there are different ways you can treat this, but there is a kernel of truth to this depiction. Scholars have pointed both to the way that the Soviet Union acted as a breaker of nations, I think the picture that we've more commonly seen in the United States, but also the ways that the Soviet Union acted as a maker of nations. And so Putin really is putting the emphasis on the maker of nation. The Soviet Union made nations, often artificially, that might not have existed. So that brings me to my second theme, one nation. The idea is that Ukrainians, Belarusians, and Russians, at the very least, share a culture, a history. Many have the same religion of orthodoxy. In many cases, there are shared languages. Many Ukrainians speak Russian as their native language. That's also true in Belarus. There's intermarriage. Many Russians and Ukrainians live on both sides of the border, and that's also true with Belarus. The Russian nationalists imagine Russia's history with Ukraine not as a colonial or imperial history, but rather as one created by a free union of the Ukrainian people, just a branch of the Russians in this view, and the Russian people, dating back to 1654. And so, again, there's a lot to dispute about this perspective. I'm not describing this as my own view, but as a Russian nationalist view. But from this perspective, the Soviet Union artificially strengthened a separate Ukrainian identity with its national policies and its creation, for the first time in history, of a distinct Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. And I think that there's an emotional side to this idea about making nations, making Ukraine. With respect to Ukraine, that is not felt on the part of Russian nationalists when they think about the non-Slavic parts of the former Soviet Union, Georgia or Armenia or the Central Asian republics. So my third theme is that Ukraine has been a failed state again, this taking on the viewpoint of a Russian nationalist. It is certainly the case that Ukraine went through a particularly difficult transition period after the collapse of communism. All of the post-Soviet states struggled economically in the 1990s, but Ukraine's struggle went very deep and it lasted very long. I think we can see that in the fact that, I started to say today, but before the Russian invasion this year, Ukraine was Europe's poorest country. Poorer than North Macedonia, poorer than tiny landlocked Moldova, poorer than Bosnia-Herzegovina. So it's a very poor country. Despite the fact that Ukraine has an abundance of natural resources, it's got some of the world's richest farmland. So this is a kind of a sorry economic performance, and it's one that Putin and Russian nationalists blame the Ukrainian government for bringing Ukraine to this point, to this place. Ukraine suffered from corruption, again, not uniquely among post-Soviet countries, but it has had a particularly bad record of corruption. And then from a Russian nationalist perspective, Ukraine has had two revolutions in the 2000s, one in 2004, one in 2014. Both were centered on Kiev, the capital city. Both pitted anti-Russianists, that's not quite the right word, but both pitted those who saw their future as oriented towards Western Europe, the EU, and Nato institutions, and those who saw in their future a continuing relationship, strong relationship with Russia, and frankly, dependency on Russia. So in each case, the revolution's result was to overturn an elected government, granted in the first case elected with a lot of irregularities, and to pivot Ukraine towards the West and away from Russia, and it was very much seen as a zero-sum game by Russians. Russians have a complex view of these events, but that centers on the way that foreign influences, now here's my fourth theme, pawn of the West, foreign influences came in and supported those protesters who overturned elections in favor of the West and in an anti-Russia way. But they also see those events as growing out of the failure and weakness of the Ukrainian state. By contrast, the Russian state has been, up until now, stable and prosperous in the Putin era. So the very long Putin era, just as a reminder, he has effectively been in power since 1999. With a brief period when he switched places with his prime minister for 4 years. So I guess, again, just the end point of this is that events that have happened in Ukraine since the collapse of the USSR have strengthened a Russian nationalist perspective in Russia that Ukraine is weak and divided. It's weak because of its weakness of its state. It's also fallen out of its natural position as part of the so-called Russian world when it really is one nation with the Russians. And it's done so because of malign outside influences from the West. And that's all. I'm going to turn this over to Keith Eddins next.
Thank you, Julie, very much. Like Julie, I'm trying to do a lot in 10 minutes, and I'm going to touch on 5 points, but I'm going to try to do the first 4 pretty darn quickly and spend most of my time on the final one. The 5 points are Russian interest and goals, second one's NATO's interest and goals, third one, Russian actions, fourth one, NATO actions, and fifth one, what's next? And I want to say right off the bat that I'm speaking primarily about Russia and NATO here, but I am not trying to deny Ukraine its sovereignty or its agency. Not at all. I'm happy to address that in the question and answer. And it's obviously a key element of what's going on in Central and Eastern Europe right now. But in developing this panel, those are my areas of experience and expertise, and that's what I want to spend some time on. In terms of Russian interest and goals, I think Julie does a very good job, as always, of providing the perspective, if you will, of an academic looking at what a Russian nationalist, as she described it, how they would describe some of these issues. I'm looking at it a little more as a diplomat from the outside. And I would start off by saying that Russian interest, just like every state has a key interest, is in providing security for itself and its people. Security in the form of non-threatening neighbors, in the form of safety from invasion or attack. But of course, Ukraine presented no threat of invasion or attack against Russia, against the Russian Federation. Rather, Putin and the Russian government saw Ukraine as a political threat in the sense that Ukraine represented a model of a large post-Soviet Slavic state that was developing, albeit slowly and not perfectly, a Western-style democracy, an EU-style functional economy, and as such, Ukraine represented competition, a competitive threat to Putin's authoritarian model. And I would argue that Putin's immediate goal, which he was very clear about, was to remove contemporary Ukraine from the political equation in political economic terms. And his longer term objective, as Julie hinted at, or maybe said directly, was restoring something akin to the old Russian Empire, or some version of a Slavic Soviet Union. A secondary goal was to weaken NATO and the EU, but I'm not going to get into that in any detail. In terms of NATO's interest and goals, I want to start off by being clear. NATO, just like the European Union, is an institution composed of independent member states. NATO does not act independently. It's not a unitary actor, if you will, since its actions and decisions reflect the will of its members. But for our purposes, I'm going to be talking about NATO as if it were a unitary actor. So in terms of interest, and that's the key point here, NATO's interest is the security of its member states. NATO's interest is in deterring an attack on any member state via its pledge of collective security. And support for Ukraine in the context of this war, in the context pre-war, and in the context post-war is all about extending NATO's commitment to protect its own member states to Ukraine, not because Ukraine is a member, but because a Russian victory would threaten the security of NATO members. In effect, providing support to Ukraine, whether it be weapons or intelligence, is extending NATO's perimeter, extending its security perimeter, and in doing so, protecting countries like Poland, Slovakia, the Baltic states, and the other NATO members in Central and Eastern Europe. An evolving objective, however, of NATO has been, as we've seen, a weakened Russia, because quite frankly, NATO's security will be enhanced if in the long term, Russia emerges weaker from this war than when it started. Okay, third point, in terms of Russian actions. No one should be surprised by the Russian army's actions, activities, either on or off the battlefield. The Russian Army's actions, behavior has been consistent with the Red Army's behavior during World War II, with the Russian Army's behavior in both the First and the Second Chechen Wars, and the Russian Army's and Air Force's actions in Syria. On the battlefield, we've seen indiscriminate use of artillery and missiles without regard for civilian casualties. Off the battlefield, we've seen atrocities against both individuals and groups of people. Russia has engaged in crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing, not to mention the crime of aggression. And again, I'm not an international lawyer. We can talk about that in Q&A if you want. From a big picture standpoint, this is Russia's style of warfare. From a smaller picture standpoint, you're seeing a lack of discipline which comes from not having a professional corps of non-commissioned officers and not having an approach to the battlefield, a battlefield approach that looks at conduct and behavior as critical elements. Fourth point, NATO's actions. I won't spend much time here. We've seen NATO pushing weapons, pushing training, pushing intelligence to the Ukrainians. NATO has been held back by a desire to avoid appearing to support offensive operations against Russia proper. But NATO has also seen its political unity increase, and I think we'll see this when NATO meets in Madrid in a couple of weeks for its latest summit, where we are likely to see Sweden and Finland approved for membership, or at least pushed forward closer to membership. The leaders of Japan, Australia, and South Korea are going to attend that NATO summit, which speaks to the situation in Ukraine. And you're going to see support for a new NATO strategic concept. You will not see Ukraine be offered NATO membership. You will not see Ukraine even be offered what's called a membership action plan, which is kind of sort of akin to what the European Union just decided to do in offering Ukraine candidate status. Now, final points. What comes next? A few days ago, a senior British military official said Russia had already, quote, strategically lost, unquote, the war in Ukraine because they will not achieve their key objectives, because NATO will emerge stronger, because Russia will be diminished. That does not mean that Russia won't achieve some tactical achievements, won't see some tactical achievements. As demonstrated in Georgia, South Ossetia, in Moldova, Transnistria, in Ukraine earlier in this decade or last decade with Crimea, Russia has and will accept so-called frozen conflicts that can then be thought out in the future, which is why the Estonian Prime Minister has made some very eloquent arguments about the need to ensure that any settlement will demonstrate that Russia has actually lost the war and that it cannot renew the war at some point. I'm running out of time here, so I'm going to close with this. You can look at the notion of some sort of settlement of the war as being very difficult for either side to accept, a political settlement of the war. I am not optimistic that this war is going to end anytime soon. I think what we're looking at is months, if not years, as the two sides try to determine what either side can accept. And I think we're all going to emerge disappointed from a moral perspective, from an outside perspective. But the key point is it has to be a Ukrainian decision. This cannot be a decision, as they said about Munich in the Czech Republic, in Czechoslovakia, o nás bez nás, about us without us. It has to be a decision that Ukraine makes, and I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you, Eugene City Club, for your kind invitation and the opportunity to participate in this event. My brief talk will spotlight how Western Europe and Germany are dealing with the war that Russia is waging against Ukraine, a brutal and utterly unjustified invasion of a peaceful and sovereign nation in direct neighborhood to the European Union. To begin with, since I'm not just speaking to you as a historian, but also as a citizen of Europe and a citizen of Germany, allow me to disclose my own position as a speaker. I'm a historian, a professor from Germany holding a chair in modern history and historical migration studies. The two fields I mostly work in are the history of migration, especially forced displacement in the aftermath of the Second World War, and the evolution of a global refugee regime on the one hand, and on the other hand, I researched the Holocaust, the German war of annihilation in Eastern Europe, and organized violence under Nazi rule. My research groups actually engaged in several projects with partners in Belarus and in Ukraine focused on sites of mass killing. And in fact, we were scheduled to spend this coming September in Berdichev, Ukraine, to conduct non-invasive surveys of graves from the Shoah. Both our own history with Ukraine and how refugees are received in Europe are relevant, I think, to understanding the current situation. Our work with partners in Central and Eastern European countries became possible during the past decades. Ukraine today is a part of the international academic community. A dense network of cooperation and joint work has grown between Ukraine and many countries. Very recently, we could not imagine at all that this could be threatened. But war in Europe became a reality again, and the disruptions are severe. Now we try to keep up connectedness. We keep it alive in ways that work under the unspeakable situation that the Russian invasion is creating. Some of our colleagues were turned into refugees, some into soldiers, and many try to hold out and protect the historical sites in their custody, even under bombardment. How did we get here? From a European perspective, things seem to go well with our immediate eastern neighbors for the past 30 years. On the political level, NATO was expanding, which was a good thing. We all know that this military alliance has purely defensive purposes. On the economic level, the EU prospered and grew. We began talks with Ukraine to join, not in the foreseeable future, but eventually. Bulgaria, Romania, Poland, and Hungary, together with other Central European countries, demonstrated that the eastward expansion was a challenge, but it could work. Even with Belarus, often and rightfully called the last dictatorship of Europe, things seemed to improve until the brutal suppression of the democratic opposition there since 2020. Apart from high politics, we all could feel the change. Ukrainian trucks began to haul goods across the European Union. People's mobility increased, and our ties grew thicker. We also experienced that in research. Students come over, contacts intensify, and joint work became much more regular, normal. We imagined that going to France or going to Ukraine would not make much of a difference in the near future. But we failed to see that Russia experienced what was happening in vastly different and distorted ways. Each step taken by Ukraine towards the West was perceived as a threat. Europe, the idea of Europe, grew into an unwelcome, since politically and economically attractive, alternative affiliation for societies in Central and Eastern Europe. That became a problem from a Russian point of view. Not everyone appreciates democracy, peace, and prosperity as good things. Eventually, we failed to step up when Russia challenged the newly gained freedoms when Putin invaded and annexed the Crimean Peninsula and occupied eastern Ukraine. How did that happen? Of course, it will always be a tough decision to sever relations or to even go to war over a piece of land far away, at least from a contemporary European perspective. We learned lessons from history. Moreover, and importantly, Germany and other countries in Europe have indeed driven themselves into a fatal dependency on Russian resources. It was tempting to accept those deals, gain access to cheap energy supplies, and do good business with Moscow, its oligarchs, and its monopolies. At the same time, however, Germany believed it was following a good plan, another lesson learned from the past. Remember, Germany and France fought wars over territory and continental hegemony for centuries. Had you asked a German or a Frenchman in 1875 if there would ever be a lasting peace, the answer would surely have been no. Nein, jamais. One path to peace after the Second World War was doing business together. That was, by the way, also a key idea of the Marshall Plan. From the 1950s on, the French and the German economy became so deeply entangled that none of the two could afford another war. We became partners and friends, allies even. It took a while, and it was not easy. And, by the way, it was us, the Germans, who started as an outlaw after 1945. That experience became part of our rationale for dealing with Russia post-1991. But there was a difference. We were dealing with an authoritarian pseudo-democracy unable to overcome its grievances from losing the Soviet Empire. While we thought we were doing business diplomacy, the other side set the stage for the next round. Commemorating the end of the Second World War in Europe, the defeat of Nazi Germany, and the liberation of my country by the Allies on May 8th, in this year, our President Walter Steinmeier spoke of an Epochenbruch, the end of an era. Chancellor Olaf Scholz, in recent speeches, prepared us for a turning point, a Zeitenwende. And indeed, we brace for an energy crisis, prepare to rearm, support Ukraine with funds, goods, and military equipment, and face the threat of being dragged into the conflict as a warring party. We live through the liminal moment of realizing that the old normal is gone. This transition includes facing the consequences of standing up against Russia, Russian aggression. A stark choice for Germany. We adopted pacifism after 1945 in the face of Germany's unspeakable crimes. But how can we now stand aside in the face of Ukraine's suffering? Kiev is about 1,200 kilometers east of Berlin. That's roughly the distance from Eugene to LA. Krakow in Poland is about 300 kilometers away from Lvov in Ukraine. That equals a drive from here to Seattle. To us, the war in Ukraine is far away, and it is very near at the same time. The westward movement of Ukrainian refugees makes this very clear every day. About 7.5 million people have left the country due to the war since February of 2022. Another 7 million people face displacement inside Ukraine. That is a third of the population, and it amounts to the most traumatic forced migration crisis in Europe since the Second World War. Recent experiences with refugees due to war and violence are not new to us. Since 2015, more than 1 million refugees from Syria and several 100,000 from Afghanistan and other places have arrived in Germany alone. That triggered an unprecedented wave of help and solidarity, but also a deep division of our society, resulting, for instance, in a new racist and xenophobic political party getting 10% of the seats in our parliament. Now, in a matter of weeks, millions of Ukrainians have found refuge in Poland and other countries bordering Ukraine. More than 600,000 refugees from Ukraine have arrived in Germany. This translates into 70,000 Ukrainians which currently live in Berlin alone. My hometown, Osnabrück, roughly the size of Eugene, harbors several thousand newly arrived Ukrainians, like most cities this size back home. Are we up to this? We might. For once, the European Union evoked the Temporary Protection Directive, which was adopted in 2001 as a consequence of the Balkan Wars of the 1990s, but had never been activated before. It provides mechanisms to react to sudden and large-scale forced displacement of people into European Union territory. This directive offers war refugees immediate and unconditional access to temporary protection, the social security systems, education, housing, and the labor market. And indeed, societies in Europe quickly opened their borders to Ukrainians. That was quite a contrast to what happened during the Syrian refugee crisis, when many European countries tried to shield themselves from providing asylum, often in quite shameful ways. And it is quite a contrast to the handling of the refugee crisis at the EU southern border in the Mediterranean, or the recent refoulement of refugees from the Middle East who tried to cross into Poland via Belarus. The solidarity with Ukraine and the unprecedented protection of refugees are encouraging for the time being and much needed relief. But it is not what we're experiencing now even the beginning of an end to this crisis. We must keep help and solidarity up in the face of mounting pressure and difficulties. We must accept that massive migration from Ukraine will change Europe profoundly. This will not go away in a couple of weeks or even years, and the political consequences are unforeseeable. Gas, energy prices for households are about to double in Germany, and many people will not know how to pay these bills. Letters announcing this arrived yesterday back at homes in Osnabrück. But as always, a crisis is also a chance to grow, and to show who we really are. The invasion is first and foremost a tragedy for Ukraine, and then also a test for our own humanity, a test we better pass. From a European perspective, one thing is obvious. The 3 decades during which we tried to lure ourselves into the predicted end of history are over. The peaceful and prosperous expansion of the Western European model has met brute force, trying to prevent free, sovereign, and democratic societies from deciding about their future. Ukraine is paying the price. We seem to have three choices now, as Herfried Münkler, a leading political scientist in Germany, recently argued. We tried to buy Russia out of its revisionism. That failed. We are now tempted to fall for appeasement and allow a Russian victory while selling out Ukraine for an illusion of peace. That will be a moral, a humanitarian, and a political disaster. We might have to prepare ourselves for fencing off Russian aggression through deterrence for quite a while. What a gruesome choice. Once more, freedom will not be free in Europe. Thank you.
Thank you to our speakers, and now we will take a 5-minute break to compose some questions. I know there will be several. Thank you.
Welcome back to City Club for our program entitled The War in Ukraine, Causes and Effects. Thank you, Dr. Hessler, Mr. Edens, and Mr. Voss for your presentations. My name is Jennifer James Long, City Club member, and we're going to begin the Q&A section. As you listened to the program, you've probably had a few questions or a desire for elaboration on certain topics, and we welcome your questions. Please come up to the mic to introduce yourself with your name so we know who you are before your question. If you're listening to the live stream on YouTube, there should be a number where you can text your question there. So the first question is about how is this war different to the world than previous wars? For example, as a photographer, I chose to hire a retoucher in Ukraine to support her through the struggles that she is experiencing. And there's been examples of people in the world having access directly to people in those kinds of ways. And I'm just wondering, what have you seen as historians that is different? Do one of you want to lead? Keith?
Are you asking me?
Yes.
Yeah. I'm not, well, first of all, I'm not a historian. I'm a diplomat or a retired diplomat. And I'm going to suggest that it's probably a lot more similarities than there are differences. I mean, some of the differences between this war and previous European wars have to do with, you alluded to, there's live streaming, there's social media, et cetera, but the reality is that the kind of aggression we've seen from the Russian Federation against Ukraine, the attempts to assert power, to gain territory, are not dissimilar, are very similar to previous wars we've seen in previous centuries in Central Europe. I mean, I've spent a lot of my career in Central Europe, and you start talking to someone in Prague, in Bratislava, in Poland, in the Balkans, and they can give you stories about very similar wars for very similar purposes going back not just centuries, but going back a millennia. So I'll leave it at that.
Do you guys want to talk to it? To that? Okay. Go ahead, Kitty.
Thank you for the presentation today. Wonderful, all three of you. I'm Kitty Piercy. I'm the past president of City Club. That's a position I'm in right now. So my question is this, as I think about politics in this country right now, and we're looking into the midterm, where things could radically change, and how that your speculation or thinking about how various incomes could affect American participation in supporting Ukraine. It's a big question. Take any piece of it, I'd say.
I could give you the foreign policy perspective of this as a European. What we're seeing and what you probably will be seeing, that as the outcomes, the consequences of these wars reach societies in terms of the refugees we care for, in terms of the energy prices we have to pay, in terms of the inflation, and in terms of the, and this is very real in Europe, the sheer feel of threat. This will probably led us to a point where we have two choices, where either political pressure is going to limit the ways that governments can actually act towards this war and do something about it, or we may be getting our act together and understand that this will be a new era in which what we do is not entirely about ourselves anymore, but we have to live for the time being this international solidarity, because if we don't do now, then we will be next. And so the decision is between the nationalistic trap and becoming a more global society.
I'll say a couple of words on this too. I'm with the caveat that I'm a Russianist, not a U.S. specialist. My sense is that it's been fairly remarkable to what extent politicians on both sides of the aisle have come together to support very, very large military appropriations bills and foreign aid bills that would send large consignments of material to Ukraine. I guess all three of us, you've probably gathered, are very pessimistic about the prospects of this war coming to a swift conclusion. And so I think that I think that we aren't likely to see an open-ended commitment to that level of spending forever. I don't know whether that's going to hit us at the midterm election cycle or whether it's going to be delayed beyond that. But I think that I would expect to see some demands, and I'm not, frankly, even sure which side of the aisle they're more likely to come from at this point, but demands to reduce military spending, not to give, not to continue at the same level of commitment to Ukraine, which has really far exceeded our commitments in some other areas, including areas like Afghanistan, where the support that the financial aid that the United States gave to the Afghan army was less than this. So I guess that's the only thing that I would say. I don't know if Keith has anything to add or no.
Stu Thomas, City Club member, or former City Club member, I don't know for sure anymore, for quite a while. My question actually it depends a little on having viewed a Fareed Zakaria special a couple of weeks ago on the mind of Putin, and in which he basically in some way likened himself to a rat that he cornered in a basement when he was a little boy. So the question is, how far, if there is political favor for it, how far can the West go in aiding the Ukrainians militarily, perhaps even sending in advisors, for example? In other words, how seriously should we take Putin's threat of nuclear retaliation?
I have to say I'm going to be interested to hear what Keith thinks about this one. And I'm probably the wrong person to ask, but I am not terrifically concerned at this minute. That would be going very far to break with the international order completely. I think at this point, Putin is still very anxious to try to maintain trading relations with other countries outside the West. He has commented that, okay, it's your loss if you no longer want our products, our oil, our gas, or so on. If you no longer want to trade with us, it's your loss. We have India, we have Vietnam, we have China, and so on. But I think that he would, I just think that he would, personally, I don't think it's very likely, because I think that the outcry would become that much more global than it already is. But I'm interested to hear what the others of you think.
So I only heard a little bit of the question, but I think I got the gist of it. And I would tend to agree with Julie. I don't think Russian use of nuclear weapons of any kind is likely. I don't think it's going to happen. But I'm a retired diplomat teaching at the University of Oregon. I don't sit in the Oval Office, I don't sit at the State Department or the Defense Department or NATO, where I have to treat the probabilities, even if it's a low, very low probability, the impact is huge if Russia was to use nuclear weapons. And that's why I alluded earlier to the fact that I think NATO has made the decision not to push offensive weapons to Ukraine. And it's very hard to differentiate between offensive weapons and defensive weapons, right? That's difficult. But they've tried to make sure that the weapons and the agreements under which the weapons are provided, the Ukrainians are not using those to advance the war into the territory of the Russian Federation. And that's where you begin to worry that if Putin felt an existential threat to his country, okay, Ukraine's not going to destroy Russia, or to his rule, then you have to worry about those kinds of things. I'm not worried about it on a personal basis, but if I were Joe Biden or Macron or someone, I have to think about it.
We have time for one more question.
Hi, I'm Alex Dracoblet. I teach history at the University of Oregon. And I've got actually a couple of interrelated questions. I'm going to put you on the spot, Christoph. And this is based on the scenario that Mr. Eddins proposed, which is that this war is going to continue for some time and move into some kind of stalemate. I mean, it has stalemated. Given that likelihood, last week I saw an article in the New York Times that for all the rhetoric in Germany, that although there's been a great deal of action on migrants, there hasn't been a lot of action with respect to either energy policy or with respect to military policy, actually implementing what he had said back in May. And I'm wondering if in a scenario of a long stalemate, what do you think the outcome is likely to be in Germany? Germany is the linchpin here. And is it likely, for instance, that Germany would start to move in the direction of significantly reorienting its economy away from cheap energy from Russia and or building up its military in a significant way?
Well, being a fellow historian, Alex, I will later look back at this and let you know. From where I stand now, the situation is this, and I'm 8,000 kilometers away from home in Eugene, in communication with colleagues and friends at home. Well, first of all, I think we are moving in that direction, changing the way we acquire and use energy has begun before because we're facing a climate crisis. And now we have to accelerate, but the time pressure is such that we're not going to make the race. Right now, Russia is diminishing the throughput of gas through Nord Stream 1 by the day, putting us under pressure. As I said yesterday, the energy prices for households doubled, right? So the pressure is really on in Europe. Add the inflation to that. So we're in the conversion, I think, but we're not going to make the race for this current war. And at the same time, we're building up the army now. We've committed to that at a degree that was really unthinkable in Germany, not just after the Second World War, but also after the end of the Cold War. I always considered myself one of the last draftees into the armed forces at the end of the Cold War. Now I'm afraid that I'm going to see my sons in uniform. So this is actually happening. At the same time, of course, we know in Germany, maybe better than most, that you can escalate a war about once. And this probably explains a lot why our government is very reluctant in getting involved in terms of defensive, offensive, heavy weapons, etc. This is a very delicate path we're walking as Germany, but also as a community of EU states or NATO countries. And I think we are moving towards deterrence. I hope we're not going to sell out Ukraine, and we're willing to pay the price for not doing that. And as we move toward deterrence, I think the question is, and is this going to be an isolated war somewhere? I think that's past. Is it going to turn into a prolonged proxy war? Every country, in the West has a lot of experience with that. Or are we moving towards a more escalated war in which EU countries or NATO will be directly involved? Obviously, we don't know. But these are the extremely difficult choices. And my pledge would be that as citizens, we start thinking about this, how we can, best be civic democratic societies in this complex scenario, departing from the usual nationalist and other egoisms that we have, and make sacrifices. And these will be real.
Thank you so much. We're out of time for the Q&A, and I thank each of you for your presentations, your participation, and questions. I'm now going to turn the podium over to Karen Knudsen.
Thank you again, Jennifer, and thank you, Dr. Hessler, Mr. Edens, and Dr. Ross for your fascinating presentations today. This has been our June 17th, 2022 City Club program, The War in Ukraine, Its Causes and Effects. And before we wrap up today, I would like to recognize our Diamond sponsors and thank them, Kaiser Permanente, who exists to provide high-quality, affordable healthcare services and to provide and improve the health of our members and the communities that we serve. More information is available at kp.org. The University of Oregon has helped Oregonians to question critically, think logically, reason effectively, communicate clearly, act creatively, and live ethically since 1876. And you can learn more information at uoregon.edu. Peace Health has been proud to serve Eugene, Lane County, and beyond as your hometown healthcare provider for more than 80 years. The Peace Health mission is to keep you and your family healthy, and you can learn more at peacehealth.org. And Lane Community College transforms lives through learning. LCC provides comprehensive, accessible, high-quality educational opportunities that promote student success, and more information is available at lanecc.edu. We are grateful for generous support from the City of Eugene and Lane County, and I would also like to acknowledge our Sapphire sponsor, Summit Bank, your local community bank. As an independent community bank headquartered here in Eugene, Summit Bank serves businesses and professionals in the Eugene, Springfield, and Central Oregon communities. And you can learn more by visiting sbko.bank. Today's program's gold sponsors are Pacific Cascade Federal Credit Union and Doctors Ferguson and Fife Dentistry. Thank you also to our in-kind sponsors, KRVM 91.9 Radio, PAC Info and Simplified Computing LLC, and Dotson's Photography. And of course, a special thank you to our award-winning public radio station, KLCC FM 89.7, for airing City Club programs on Monday nights at 7 p.m. All programs are available on our YouTube channel, Facebook page, and as podcasts, and we invite everyone, members and non-members alike, to participate in City Club programs in person at our 2022 venue, the First United Methodist Church at 1376 Olive Street. You can also join us live stream or catch up via YouTube, and more information is available at cityclubofelugene.org. Next week, our next program during the United States Track and Field Championships which will determine the participants in the Oregon 22 World Championships, City Club will host a program focused on Tracktown's history and future, from pre to tomorrow, the magic of Tracktown, USA. More details and information about future programs can be found online at City Club's website, cityclubofelugene.org, and we invite everyone to join us in person for these programs. Thank you again to today's speakers, Dr. Julie Hessler, Mr. Keith Edens, and Dr. Christoph Ross. We appreciate what you have helped us to learn so much and your calls forward into the future. It has been a pleasure to welcome you to City Club today. Please be well, stay safe, and we look forward to connecting again next week.